One more time, all committee chair come to the front of the line. We are a little bit disorganized because the Senate just got out of this room. They don't understand that it's got mine and Terry's name on it. But we do need to hold it down to a loud roar in here. What did Richard tell y'all? There you go. Nobody heard. If you're a committee chairman, come to the front of the line. Try not to get in front of any other committee chairman, but.
We're going alphabetical.
Ms. Hughley, you want to talk? There's a button on over there somewhere. See if there's a button pushed. Who is it? Never mind, it's you. Okay. Am I losing you again? Y'all bow with me. Gracious Heavenly Father, for another day in this kingdom, thank you for all the wonderful things you continually do for us, for the opportunities you give us. Hopefully you'll give us the wisdom and character to do the right things. Lead, guide, and direct us. Keep your hand on us. Let us do pleasing things in your sight. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, we're going to start, and has everybody on the committee got a blue sheet? Okay, I'll use it. Put one right there. Oh, they're in the book. I ain't got a book. If you hadn't got a book, you haven't got a blue sheet. Okay. Number 15 on your scorecard and number 1 in your heart. My appropriations chairman, Mr. England.
I don't know about all that, Mr. Chairman. I do want to apologize. We do not have a fiscal note to go along with this bill. The whip had asked me about that a minute ago. I just will tell you it will have a huge fiscal impact if we don't pass it. House Bill 742 is the 2013 budget. Be glad to answer any questions if anybody has any, but we'll have plenty of time for that tomorrow too, hopefully.
Y'all, we're going to limit him to debate tomorrow to about 15 minutes, but so he's going to talk real quick. Are there any questions, and I better not hear any, of Mr. England? Thank you, Mr. England.
All right.
Mr. Parsons.
Thank you, Chairman. I have House Bill 818. It's under structured rule on page 4. There's currently an income tax credit for the installation of what they call clean energy property. And one of those types of clean energy property is geothermal heating and cooling systems. What this bill does is it changes or it adds some additional language that three-phase or triple-phase, I guess they call it, geothermal systems can be added to that income tax credit. They can currently get the credit now by putting in 3 of the single phase. This is just a more efficient way of doing it. And one other change to the bill that was done in committee was that last year we'd increased the limit on the amount of money to come out of the general fund from $2.5 million to $5 million. This bill also in 2014 brings that back down to 2.5, so we can kind of look and see what the budget's like and what kind of revenue is coming in. And with that, I would ask for your pass it on the floor.
Are there any questions, Mr. Parsons? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring House Bill 1178, which deals with the
I tell you, Tom, can I interrupt you for a second? Not for you, but when you come up here, tell us what page it's on.
Page 2.
I got you.
Middle of the page.
All right.
This bill simply requires for bills coming before the Education Committee that have a funding impact that the fiscal note shall include a 10-year projection of costs. That's to try to keep us from getting into this situation where we have to stop a program 2 or 3 years in because it suddenly has become too expensive, something we've had to do several times in the last few years. Would appreciate your acceptance of that.
Are there any questions of Mr. Dixon? Thank you. Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My bill is House Bill 953. The first one is at the bottom of page 1 under modified open rule. Again, that's the funeral service consumer affairs bill there, and we've been here a couple times on that. On page 2, House Bill 450 at the bottom of the page, it's set off debt collection for the public housing. We really need that bill if we can. And then my last 3 are on page 2, middle of the page, House Bill 1120, 21, and 19, excuse me. All these are just changing the partisan and nonpartisan elections in my part of the world.
Any questions, Mr. Sims? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Maxwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I bring to you House Bill 651. It's on page 1, and basically what we're doing here is repealing the charter system grants that we put in a few years ago. If we'd passed Representative Dixon's bill 1178, this might preclude this from happening again. But we're striking 4 lines on the legislation that we passed, I think it was 3 years ago, that deals with the additional full-time equivalents we pay for the charter systems. And I believe the governor has already taken this out of his budget for 2013. We'll see that tomorrow when we look at the budget. I'd ask for your favorable consideration, sir.
Has anybody got any questions of my mentor? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, does this mean that for those is this the bill that addresses charter systems and requires that those schools that are currently receiving the $100 extra per student, that they would no longer receive those funds?
Yes, ma'am. That's what this bill does.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. Ms. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring you House Bill 1071. It's on page 4. 1071, one of the things it does away with a lifetime license to be a retail seller of tobacco. The Department of Revenue is putting in an integrated tax system, and we hope by having a license with the expiration date on it, we can coordinate who's supposed to be paying sales tax on cigarettes and who's really the seller of cigarettes. And the license fee is just a minimum of $10 a year to be a retail seller of cigarettes, but it lasts for just a year. And we also, in this bill, we've put in you can renew this license when you renew your alcohol license at the same time. And it also cracks down on people who are bringing illegal cigarettes and cigars into the state. It puts a penalty if you're bringing illegal cigarettes and cigars in the state and loose tobacco. And it also defines a small cigar. I'll be happy to ask any questions.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got two bills, last page under structured, House Bill 965 and 967. These are two bills brought before to us by the Georgia Society of CPAs. Simple compliance issues they're going to solve. One is a gotcha situation with estates and trust. The feds allow a 2-year exemption to set up estates and trust before estimated tax payments are due. Georgia is currently got our folks in a gotcha situation because we're still on the old calendar way of doing estimated payments. So in some cases, these trusts haven't even picked a year in, and they're already under a situation for a penalty under Georgia estimated tax code. So that's one bill. Second bill modernizes our withholding on non-resident members. We're the only state in the southeastern region that has a tax on distributions paid or distributions credited but not paid. We're simply wanting to simplify this language and just put it back to who the tax is due on the source income at the due date of the tax return. That's what these two bills do.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. I have three propositions on page 3. First item is House Bill HB 844, 7th from the top on page 3, modified structured rule. House Bill 844 seeks to clarify a thorough and timely validation of bonds issued by your development authorities. I've discussed this with the committee previously and would answer any questions. But it seeks to have a thorough and timely validation of development authority bonds. If there are any questions, I'd answer them on that one, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions?
If not, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go to number 9 on that same page 3, House Bill 920. This bill seeks to add to the tax expenditure report relevant information when it's available and where possible to define the objective legislative intent of a tax expenditure. That would be a tax credit or a tax exemption. Further information if that legislative intent is producing, if that credit is producing what the legislative intent means and its overall impact on the state's ability to tax, given the focus on tax reform at this time, providing that information to the Ways and Means Committee and the Appropriations Committee as part of the tax expenditure report, I believe would be helpful, and ask the committee's favorable recommendation on House Bill 920 and answer any questions.
Any questions? Thank you.
Last item, if I may, Mr. Chairman, is at the bottom of that same page, page 3, H.R. 1237. This is a resolution urging Congress to allow us to keep our federal fuel tax money. As many of you know, they collect that money. I think it's 18.4 cents. It started at less than a penny back years and years ago. But they collect that money, and then we have to go to Washington and ask for it back. We're just asking that we move forward this resolution and ask Congress to work on that and allow us to keep the money in Georgia. Cut out the middleman, if you will, Mr. Chairman. Answer any questions on H.R. 1237. Ask the committee's favorable recommendation to move that forward to the floor for a vote.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have two bills. House Bill 247, which is page 2, modified structure near the bottom of the page. Last year we passed a bill requiring EMTs to have background checks before they could be certified. An unintended consequence of that bill, I received an email from my local fire chief expressing his concern that his firefighters who already were certified and had already had criminal background checks were having to go to a local pawn shop to get a second criminal background check in order to become licensed as EMTs, because that's where the only local provider was, and paying $60 at a local pawn shop to get a second criminal background check in order to get the EMT. This simply closes that loophole and says if you're a certified firefighter that to get an EMT's license, all you have to do is have the fire chief to certify to the licensing board that you have undergone that criminal background check.
Question. Have you got an amendment on that one?
There is an amendment on that. I think you all have that amendment.
Why don't you go ahead and tell us what the amendment does on that thing right now?
The amendment was an amendment that was brought to my attention by a member of the House who had a firefighter that was convicted of a felon. And this firefighter, the fire chief of that local fire department, brought to the attention of one of our members that that there was not an automatic decertification of a firefighter who was convicted of a felony, and the amendment addresses a decertification process for firefighters, and make sure that a firefighter convicted of felony shall have his certification revoked.
We don't have that amendment. That's another bill.
It was turned into your office last week.
Okay. We will have that amendment shortly. Is that 247? We need to find the one he turned in last week, 247. All right. We got time. We got time, don't y'all? They're lined up to right back there. Okay, do the next one.
House Bill 952, page 3, modified structured, just above halfway down the page. This provides the option, not mandated, but the option for a healthcare provider to, in consultation with their patient, to provide a prescription requiring tamper-resistant opioids. We know that opiate abuse is a major problem here in the state of Georgia, as it is in many states. And this simply would say that if a healthcare provider puts on the prescription that tamper-resistant formulation is required, that the pharmacist cannot substitute a prescription that is not tamper-resistant.
Any questions?
I do have an amendment to this as well, Mr. Chairman.
Won't you tell us what it does?
Pardon?
Tell me what it does.
The amendment is an amendment that was brought after the bill had gotten 2 rules, and a couple of our health insurance companies had some concerns about the bill, and the amendment strikes a couple of portions of that bill, makes it easier for the health insurance companies to be able to support, and we certainly would ask for not only the consideration of the bill, but also consideration of the amendment.
Any questions, Mr. Neal? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committees, I bring to you House Bill 1067, modified open rule on page 2. It's a simple insurance bill. I know Chairman Smith's interested in it and signed the bill. In fact, the majority whip, the company is locating in Buckhead. So I thought, okay. going to bring 250 people to Buckhead. I don't think it's the new town of Ashbury or whatever it is, but it is Buckhead, so. It has been perfected, just allows a retail phone computer center to sell insurance on the equipment like iPhones, iPads, tablets, and smartphones. And the other bill that seems to be so exciting is House Bill 1175. Page 3, modified structure, seemed to bring a lot of attention to the committee, but I don't know if an agreement's been made on that or not, so it has not, no agreement. I know Chairman Wendell Willard was going to move the bill Monday out of the committee, but I'm not sure that was done.
And that was a different number anyway. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Pruitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, I bring you to modified open House Bill 1159. And this bill actually is a bill that's been worked on by Ms. Ellie Dodd for a couple of years through the Hospital Association, Children's Association. And it's appointing a joint committee at no cost to the state to study ways that we can help prevent children death, particularly in the area of SIDS, shaken baby syndrome, kids left in cars, hot cars, and things like that. And it's an educational process to be put together to develop a video and other training ways that a parent could see videos and get training prior to leaving the hospital with their newborn, and then able to take information home with them also to share with the babysitter and other caregivers.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Maddox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee members. At the top of page 3, I bring to you substitute HB 685, the Responsible Dog Ownership Law. It's become more common to read about dog attacks causing serious injuries and even death. This bill simply identifies the difference between a dangerous dog and a vicious dog, and then gives a local law enforcement the authority to act at the time of this attack. It's now time for dog owners to take responsibility for their animals, and this bill will help solve this problem in the state of Georgia. I ask for a favorable vote. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the first page, modified open rule, HB 678 is about 10 bills down. This is a simple bill, basically designed to give a little structure to our mattress regulation laws, basically stating that companies selling used mattresses cladded in new material must actually put a sign up and state that these mattresses are actually used mattresses. I ask for your favorable consideration. And
I have a question, Ms. Sheldon. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Lindsay.
Just a quick question. Part of the bill requires inspection by the Department of Agriculture.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. I have. They were actually in the committee and testified before the committee, and actually they did have some appropriation concerns, but other than that, they said that they could handle it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Fullerton. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My bill is on the first page, the sixth one down, modified open rule. It has to do, it is general legislation, not local, but it has to do, at this point, it would specifically apply to my probate judge in keeping her and keeping that position an attorney, as opposed to, because our population has dropped below the threshold of 96,000, would maintain her being qualified as an attorney to be in that position.
Any questions? Thank you. Whoa. Mr. Roberts.
Thank you. And Representative Fulton, I hadn't had a chance to look over it just yet, but it defines only in the bill, it narrows it to only Dougherty County. Is that what you're saying?
At this point, it would affect only Dougherty County. If we don't, because our population has dropped below the threshold, if we do not pass it, because she has 2 court cases against her, our population, because the population dropped, they were saying they want to go on to Superior Court and not go through her court. I guess they thought they had a better chance. So it would burden the Superior Court calendar more. But these 2 cases are now on appeal to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court, it's my understanding, if the Supreme Court rules on this, it could open up a bailiwick of trouble for all the metropolitan counties who have larger populations. I'm sure the chairman can explain it better than I can.
Mr.
Ms. Fulton, I want to be clear, we're not changing the law because of what may or may not happen as to probate court to Superior Court. We're changing the law because there is a classification that your probate judge would now not be required to be a lawyer, member of the bar, because the population changed and Dougherty County has dropped down below what is the minimum. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So the purpose of this is to be sure Dougherty County can and will continue to have a member of the bar serving as a probate judge in the future. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I bring you today House Bill 715. Currently, Georgia law provides that municipal governments can contract with their county government and their county tax commissioner for tax billing and collection services. The municipality is required to compensate the county for the approximate cost of providing this service. However, it also allows for the tax commissioner to request and receive personal compensation directly from the city. House Bill 715 provides a process for a single contract negotiated between the 3 parties and prohibits contracts directly between the municipal government and the tax commissioner. House Bill 715 will protect the taxpayers in Georgia's cities from excessive payment for tax collection services. I ask for your favorable consideration.
Any questions, Ms. Riley? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Buckner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, if you'll look on page 3, it's HR 1161 under modified structure. This is a compensation resolution, and there is a committee substitute on your desk. It's LC number 371451S. And I'll explain the small change that had to be made. But basically, Mr. Cawley visited a Department of Labor office in our state, and there was an accident where his back and neck were hurt. He has no insurance, and he is asking that his medical bills be covered. The Department of Labor admitted that the chairs that he actually were sitting in were new, and that they were not supposed to have rollers on them, and they accepted responsibility for the accident and recommended that he contact the claims compensation board at the Secretary of State's office, who then contacted me, and we started this process. He's asking for $7,500, which has been put in the budget for his medical bills. The substitute you have on your desk on line 20 is the only change. In the original bill. It said the money would go to the Department of Labor instead of the Department of Administrative Services, and that's why there had to be a substitute to make that language correct.
Any questions? Thank you. Next one.
Okay. May I also remind people that on page 1, under modified open, there's a House Bill 684 I would appreciate as well. Thank you.
We didn't call you to come up, did we? Did I say get behind the microphone?
Sir.
Did I ask for you to get behind the microphone? No. How many times you been in here?
This is my first.
Oh, that's a damn shame. Oh, that's a shame.
Well, thank you, Mr.
I don't know if
Chairman.
that just came out over the airways, but excuse me, it was not proper. Okay, let's see. I haven't gotten any peaches.
They're coming. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. At the bottom of page 3, near the bottom, modified structure, I bring you House Bill 1132. This is Fair Business Telemarketing Protection Act. This bill requires a code of conduct for telemarketing companies to conduct their business in the state. It requires them to identify the caller, not block or give false numbers, give a working number, and its bill does not apply to calls of a political nature. I'll entertain any questions.
This bill doesn't, what was that last statement? This bill doesn't do what? This bill doesn't do what? What was that last statement?
It does not apply to calls of a political nature.
Boy, that's going to make a lot of folks happy. Yeah. Let's get those calls. Okay, thank you. No questions.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mr. Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Look on page 1 at the bottom. That's House Bill 1064. That's 1064. This bill is a coastal bill, essentially to promote tourism along the coast of Georgia. What this bill does is it relaxes the 30-day live aboard restriction that the time that you can live on your boat in Georgia. The reason for this bill is because there's something called the Great Loop. It comes from Wisconsin, goes all the way to the Gulf Coast, and at any one given time, there's about 200 to 300 boats in this circuit, and they could actually be coming to the coast of Georgia, docking in our marinas, and actually spending money in our coastal towns like Savannah all the way to St. Mary's. This is an economic development bill. While it's not perfect, and I would have liked to have totally repeal that provision, I did need to had to work with the DNR officials to come up with a compromise to go into the Tidewaters Act and the Marshlands Protection Act to make sure that mooring zones or fields were actually defined by the department so they could actually stay in compliance with that law. So this bill would actually help tourism on the coast, and I ask for your favorable consideration.
Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Spencer, so currently in Georgia, you can't live on your boat in any one spot for more than 30 days.
Right. Georgia, we're the only coast on the state on the eastern seaboard that has this very restrictive law. We have a very bad reputation to boaters. They often skip Georgia to go to either to Florida or to Hilton Head or to the northern part of the coast in the United States. So this would help Georgia's reputation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just my observation that we touch so many different code sections with this bill, and we have vetted this particular part very well, but it could open it up to lots of other kinds of amendments. So I respectfully ask that you consider modified structure for its classification.
Any other questions?
Thank
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Powell.
Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay.
You're on, brother.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bring to you House Bill 985. This is seems like the annual Department of Revenue bill on tags and titles. It makes their process work a little bit smoother each year. This bill provides that temp tags must be issued pending the transfer of a permanent plate and eliminates the requirement that a temp tag be surrendered once a vehicle is registered. The DOR technology has advanced so that it automatically cancels those that aren't needed. Also allows that the transferor and the transferee can apply to a county tag agent for an extension of a temporary tag. This is due to the fact that even though the state law says that you have to cure a lien on a vehicle and transfer that title to a new owner within 10 days, that's not always the case because of out-of-state liens. So this would allow for a extension of the temporary tags. It also deals with language on the disabled parking. I think a year or so ago that we had passed legislation that specified card stock and lamination and such on handicap decals, and they have found after a year that they cannot comply because these certain card stock and lamination has clogged up almost every printer in every tax office in the state. So they're working on new technology over at Revenue to get these things printed in a different way.
Any questions? Thank you.
Second one, if I may, just one last time, I hope, House Bill 166. That was one that I'd brought before you before, that allows, that's been asked for by the licensing boards, the engineers and the surveyors, to provide a pathway of a college, a four-year college degree for licensing.
And your promise is this is the last time you'll ask for that?
God help me, it is.
Okay, Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I bring before you on page 4, top of the page, House Bill 29, Tax Amnesty Program Act. What this bill will do is will offer those citizens who owe back income taxes an opportunity to pay those taxes, waiving the penalties from 1991 up until December of 2010. The fiscal note on this bill is that it will bring in approximately on the lower end $80 million, on the top end $180 million. And this is the last time we did tax amnesty was about 30 years ago in this state. So I ask for your consideration on House Bill 29.
Are there any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Braddock.
Under modified open rule on page 2, I bring before you House Bill 1093. It's a simple little repeal bill, and basically it just repeals the requirement that grocery stores and retail stores post signs saying that you cannot steal their shopping carts. They're currently having fines imposed on them by local cities and counties, so it's just to repeal that unnecessary requirement.
If we don't do something with this bill, about half the speeches that I give out here are gone, because that's probably the meat of every speech I give. What we've done down here that's not real bright.
We'll find you some new content.
Thank you. Any questions, Ms. Braddock? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since tomorrow is my birthday, I would like...
Happy birthday to you.
And because I'm a trust but verify person, I've brought my driver's license in case you want to... Two-thirds of the way down on modified open rule on page 1, I'd like to ask again for 821, which makes amendments to Georgia's truancy law to assist local school systems in enforcing this statute.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Harden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I have a bill 861 on the back page under structured. Simple little bill to require those receiving TANF benefits to submit to drug screens for 3 reasons. Number one, it's going to help these folks get on the radar screen to where they can get the much needed help that they deserve. Second is to protect the children of this state where those benefits are intended to go. And number 3 is the taxpayer, to ensure the taxpayers of this state that their money is not being used to subsidize illegal drug activity. Mr. Chairman, if there's any questions.
There is questions. The Minority Leader, Ms. Abrams.
Thank you. Mr. Harden, on line, let's see, if you can look at line 53 through 56 of your bill.
Okay.
What happens to a family during the time that they're delayed waiting for the drug test to be completed?
Well, the drug tests that DHR currently administer through your local DFACS office are urine screens, and they're immediate.
Okay. And then who pays for the cost of these screens?
It is the recipient. They're capped at $40, which one random screen a year is going to be the result of about $3 a month deducted from their benefits.
And what's the average benefit that these families receive?
I understand it's somewhere around $280.
The other question I have is is this money going to be refunded by the federal government to the state, or will the state now incur the cost as we wait for? So let's assume that a person, does the federal government permit the state to deduct money for these purposes under the terms of this bill? Is this constitutional? Does the federal government allow the state to use drug testing as a reason for deducting funds, the minimal amount we give, which is $280? Are we allowed to deduct at least 10% of their money for this purpose? Is that constitutional?
Well, the short answer is food stamps themselves are federally funded through the USDA. TANF benefits from which we're discussing in this bill are 100% state dollars. So we do not need the federal's permission there, but in my opinion, yes, ma'am, it is constitutional.
So there is no constitutional question. There's never been a constitutional question raised about this type of bill?
Oh, I'm sure a lot of folks have raised a lot of questions, but I do not believe it's unconstitutional.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'd like to ask for your consideration House Bill 1089. It's on midway down on the 3rd page. This is essentially a population act. This in my bill is asking to remove this section, Chapter 67 of Title 36. We're asking to remove this code section. As I understand it, population acts are unconstitutional, but nevertheless have been grandfathered in. And in addition, these review procedures are being performed by the counties that this population act has targeted, which includes DeKalb and Fulton. Unless we do anything, it will pull in Cobb and Gwinnett as well. Having said that, in Chapter 66 of the same Title 36, that basically pertains to zoning procedures law, and that applies to all of our 159 counties in Georgia. So what this bill basically does is remove some unnecessary and unconstitutional wording from the code.
Questions? Thank you. Mr. Flood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. 5th bill down on the first page, modified open rule. I bring to your attention House Bill 398. It's essentially a cleanup bill. It's a general bill, but only applies to Fulton County's school board members who are not teachers, who are not members of the teachers' retirement system, and essentially corrects some typographical errors and amends the bill to come into compliance with federal law.
Mr. Lindsay.
Just real briefly, was this a request from our Fulton County Board?
Yes, sir. It's unanimous consideration from the school board to support this.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Further on the page, Mr. Chairman, if you please, House Bill 816 is a jobs creation bill. It is a Georgia Buy American Act that will help create jobs by encouraging the state to buy products that are made in the state of Georgia or in the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. House Bill 857 is on the first page, 6 from the bottom. This bill will require daycare centers to install safety alarms in vehicles used to transport children.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Dudgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bring you again House Bill 1115, the middle of page 2, modified open. This bill does three things. It removes all references to telegraph companies from the code. It gets rid of 2 obsolete reports from Public Service Commission, but it also does a bit of deregulation around telecom companies in care of last resort. We're getting rid of the state regulation here because the federal already supersedes this, and the federal FCC is going to go through a modernization process of how they do that. We want to get the state regulations out of the way so the federal government can modernize that procedure.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Brockway.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Top of page 3, the second bill there, House Bill 748. Bring it back before you. This bill would allow adopted adults to obtain a copy of their original birth certificate. We added an amendment that provides for a contact preference form that would allow parents who are giving up their children for adoption to express their desire or lack thereof to be contacted in the future. This bill has the support of the Georgia Council of Adoption Lawyers and several other groups that are work in the adoption field. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
There are no questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Could you start your stopwatch? I'm going to try to make this short. I've got a population bill here and ask for your support. Thank you.
Which one? Number, page?
1089. HB 1080. No, excuse me. HB 1165. HB 1165, please.
Where is it?
And that was page 3 toward the bottom.
It's a good thing I didn't have the gong. You'd have never
I did too
made
well
it
being
through
quick,
this.
did I?
I'm going to have to talk to staff about that gong. Where is it? Oh, Tyler. Here you go, Tyler. Anything else?
I do have a second bill.
Won't you do it?
Thank you.
Since I had got the
bottom
gong.
of page 2, it's a substitute for HB 669. This bill would do 2 things. It calls for the Department of Audits and Accounts to prepare a short report that would would give the total sum of the aggregate value of federal revenue that each state agency receives, the amount appropriated by the legislature, and the percentage of those federal funds that make up their budget. Secondly, calls for a study committee, a study group to evaluate whether or not we should ask agencies to prepare contingency plans based on future cuts in federal funds. And this is in part due to the super committee last year not reaching a conclusion on reducing federal deficit, and there being a 9% across the board federal cut in FY 2013. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, we got a question. Mr. Earhart.
Just really quickly, what's the difference in a study committee and a study group? Is one more friendly than the other?
I think a group is smaller in size. And it would involve 2 committees, the House Committee on Government Affairs, as well as the Senate Government Oversight Committee.
So 2 committees.
2 of them together to study.
That's new terminology for me.
Okay.
Study group.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Pack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'll bring before you House Bill 940, which is in page 3, the 10th one down, on modified structural rule. This is a cost containment measure, Mr. Chairman. It relates to the fees and expenses procedures by which they submit an invoice. Those attorneys who are appointed to defend in capital cases when the Capital Defender's Office is conflicted out. All it does is it requires a submission of an invoice to a judge presiding over the case. He or she obviously is more familiar with the facts of the case and could determine and review the invoice for reasonableness before submission for payment for the counsel.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Got one bill today, House Bill 872 on page 3 under modified structures. This is the metal theft bill that we've been working on for quite a while. I would be lying if I said it was a simple bill, because it certainly has not been simple, but there's been a lot of work with a lot of different stakeholders, including the industry, to come up with what we think will be a good bill to help people. This is a growing problem in the state. A lot of folks being victimized. What the bill does is it would require anybody selling coils associated with heating and air equipment to only be sold by licensed contractors unless proof of ownership is provided. It creates a statewide registration system requiring all secondary metals recyclers to become registered with law enforcement and create a statewide database with Secretary of State. The database also would be applied to the transactional records. That's the photographs and copies of IDs and so forth. That database is what law enforcement is really needing to go after these folks and be able to solve the crimes without having to get in their car and go to every single one of these fixed sites and look through all these files. They'll be able to click a few buttons and find out if their suspect has been involved. It requires payment to be made by check or electronic funds transfer. Right now it's just copper, so it would require all metals. It's a comprehensive bill. Local ordinance has been looked at to make sure it doesn't affect any zoning issues. Restitution is included to compensate the victims fully. It also deals with the auto section and requires liens to be searched before a vehicle can be crushed, and also adds trailers to the equation because they're also being stolen at times also. And there's also an amendment to the committee substitute AM 370171. There's a lot of concern over the payment issue requiring, the bill requires that the check be mailed. And this would delete that altogether. It does tighten up the identification required of the seller to make sure that we have a valid ID so we know where these folks live if we do determine that the items were stolen.
Any questions? Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just curious, I know at one time we had a 14-day waiting period. Is that out of the bill?
Yeah, this bill has changed quite a bit. It's, I said it's not simple, but it has been shortened somewhat. And yeah, it started out with a 15-day waiting period and went to 14, and we've cut that out because obviously there was concerns over whether or not it was too much burden on the industry. It is a very viable industry in the state, and we're not trying to go after the good guys, but unfortunately there's some folks kind of flying under the radar, if you will, and this bill also gets into the definitions of who is recycling, and it doesn't have to be a business. It can be individuals that quite frankly operate out of the back of a pickup.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Rules Committee, I bring to you on page 2 at the bottom, House Bill 658. This very short bill works to change or amend the provisions that deal with the reduction of earnings to present value in tort litigation and determines the present value of certain future damages. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Teasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Rules Committee, I bring before you House Bill 946, which is on page 1 under modified open, fifth from the bottom. And this is the second bill from the Department of Banking and Finance. Does three basic things. Number one, has some cleanup language and strengthening if you've taken a test out of the test and you've been engaged in activity that is unbecoming, strengthens Georgia's language there. Second part, in section 4, basically says if a mortgage servicer has surrendered their license, they can continue to service the mortgage for 6 months as they transition to a new service provider. And then thirdly, does some cleanup language in sections 1, 3, 5, and 6, changing basic words. I'll yield for any questions.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
everybody on the committee that's got one hit your button, and we'll go in order. Mr. Willard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Mr. Jacobs, who's not here today, he has two bills right under my bill, which is on third page. HB 1048 is mine, the Civil Practice Act. Clearing up some language the judges asked to be done. We're preparing some rules on private process service, so I brought that bill forward. Below that is HB 1051, dealing with the transit system, MARTA, and extends a time frame for the ability of MARTA to use the 1 cent sales tax fully for operation. And then HB 1052 changes some of the governance language in the board to give a broader representation on the board.
If you have questions, this is the time to raise your hand, Mr. Earhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Willard, on the 1048, are we going back to trying to take out the language where the sheriff of the county?
No, it's not. In fact, under the code section 911 4.1, which was the private processor bill from 2 years ago, that all stays in there. What you have is a conflict of some language under that provision, which shows that the court has the ultimate authority to appoint a private process server, and they're doing some adoption of rules that should become effective hopefully in July. There's conflicting language in the old section of the code on that point, and that's what they have asked to be changed.
I thought we gave them the same exception in the other. We did not?
The same exception, but because the language in 4.1 says the Superior Court has the ultimate right to appoint a process server, that was a confusing part under the 11.4 section, 911.4, excuse me. I'll be sit down and show you what I'm talking about.
Mr. Stevens.
On page 4, House Bill 379, the sales tax exemption for the federally qualified health care centers. Also, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put my name beside House Bill 855 on page 1, Representative Hamilton's bill. House Bill 450 on page 2, Representative Sims' bill. Page 4, House Bill 715, Representative Riley's bill. And lastly, House Bill 29, Representative Keith Hurd's bill. And, Mr. Chairman, if there's no opposition, I'd like to move that House Bill 1027 go back to committee. Recommitted.
Mr. Stevens has asked that we recommit 1027. And I have a move. Do I hear a second? All in favor signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, it's back in committee. All right, Ms. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for House Bill 1110. That one deals with elder abuse, several issues, but the main one is that our elder abuse law now has 2 constitutional challenges against it in murder cases for being too broad, and this narrows it. And I'd like to put my 1110, third page, sorry. And on page 3, I'd also like to put my name by 952. That's Jay Neal's bill about the tamper-proof medications, which gives us another way to combat prescription drug abuse. And on page 2, I'd like to put my name by 1115. Thank you.
Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for 2 bills I've already previously asked for. One is HB 822, which is the Georgia Taxpayer Protection False Claims Act, and also HB 994, which is an amendment to Georgia's ad valorem taxation laws dealing with brownfield property to allow more flexibility for folks developing brownfield areas.
Any questions? Thank you. Ms. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask for HB 797, the enabling legislation for 1162.
Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to request House Bill 1123, deals with annexation of unincorporated islands by municipalities.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Casas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 1, I'd like to ask for HB 792, which allows private colleges to operate in the state of Georgia by means of accreditation. And I would like to put my name beside HB 1115.
Mr. Rice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the last page, 851's population bill, and it keeps everything the way it is with the big counties. I'd like to put my name beside that DOR bill 985 and 1165, which is the population bill that Mr. Clark so aptly explained, and then 1115, Mr. Dudgeon's bill having to do with telecom.
Mr. Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3, about two-thirds of the way down, I'd like to ask for HB 1114. As we found out back in February, there currently is no law in Georgia prohibiting assisted suicide. And 1114 would make it clear that one cannot help another person kill themselves. There's an amendment that further clarifies that food and water can be withheld pursuant to consent or an advance directive. So this bill's the result of a lot of work with the hospital, medical, and the Attorney General's office.
Any questions? Thank you. Ms. Drenner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for House Bill 961. It's on page 1 under the modified open rule. It has to do with the homeowner's solar bill rights.
Ms. Dempsey.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. A bill that is not on here, but at your suggestion, I wanted to let the committee be aware of it, that it may show up tomorrow. It's HB 432, the Family Care Act.
Again, it's not on there, and I told her to come since tomorrow's going to be kind of a funny day. If any of you laugh. Mr. Peake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here to ask for, again, HB 100, which is the creation of the Georgia Tax Court, or what we're now calling the Georgia Tax Tribunal. It's on page 2, unmodified structured rule. Would also like to put my name beside and support HB 748, Representative Brockway's bill, and HB 732, Representative Dickey's bill as well, too. Thanks.
Mr. Hembry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3, House Bill 827, fleeing or attempting to elude police. I'd like to request that and also have an amendment. And I'd like to put my name beside House Bill 792, Representative Cassis' bill.
Bill, what was the original number? I didn't catch you.
It's page 3, House Bill 827, and the amendment is printed. It's AM 350274.
Okay. Mr. Earhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, the House recommitted House Bill 673 of Representative Mitchell's to the Committee on Rules. He and I have worked together on a substitute AM 331182 that's on your desk. It's not on the blue sheet because it was recommitted, but it is in this committee and is available. I'd like to ask for that.
Okay. The Minority Leader, Ms. Abrams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask the favor of the Rules Committee to add the following bills. HB 29, which will add $80 million to our coffers. HB 684, HB 816, HB 681, and HB 821.
Ms. Hughley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring to the committee's consideration H.R. 1160. It's a compensation resolution for Mr. Word, who was wrongfully incarcerated for over 11 and a half years. I also bring to your attention HB 857, HB 678, HB 961, 534, and 398.
Mr. Earhart, you push it again.
Mr. Chairman, I neglected to ask for a bill I had promised to ask for, so I've been reminded. Ms. Dobbs's HB 1159, that's a study commission on education of parents with newborn children.
Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to put my name beside 665, 1115, 1141, 247, which is my chairman said is very important for us, and 872 and House Bill 29.
Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too wish to put my name by HB 29 as well as HB 678, HB 681, HB 684, HB 816, HB 821, HB 857, and also HB 55, the Universal Access Fund.
Ms. Sims.
House Bill 665, please.
Mr. Smurray.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask that we do H.R. 1161. That's a compensation resolution that we did on yesterday in the Appropriations Committee. And then I also like to ask for consideration on two other measures. One is HB 855, Universal Access Fund, and the other one is HB 857 on daycare centers. Thank you.
Ms. Manning.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. If I might put my name by House Bill 818, House Bill 1132, House Bill 534, and House Bill 1189.
Mr. Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to put my name beside House Bill 1178, House Bill 685, 872, and 1132.
Mr. Rice.
I just turned it off.
Got you dazed out there. Anybody else got one? I do.
Move.
Second. I bring House Bill 11, and I can't keep up with my own, much less y'all's. Do I hear a second? But I've got the grandparents' bill. It's 1198. It basically has a way for grandparents, and I know y'all have all been down here at least as long as I have, and I know you've all gotten requests from grandparents. Mr. Willard has been kind enough to help me on this bill. I had to take a 15-minute course in how long I've got to spread this out. I figured. But gives the courts a couple of options that they could consider if it was deemed that the child could be harmed without contact. It also sets a time limit of not less than 24 hours. And then it asks that the parents notify the grandparents for any public situation where there's an athletic event, a recital, or a school play or something like that. Fairly simple, but might give some folks some relief. Okay, y'all ready? Mine's going to be on the regular bill. and we might as well talk about that just a second. You know that I can't put all these bills on here. Everybody do like this. Anybody that doesn't do like that, their bill ain't going to get on. And all of you have been here, so you know that on the 30th day, sometimes we get an extension. So when I walk out that door, you leave me alone. And tell the people in the hall to leave me alone. All right, we're going to start on the first page. Modified open. House Bill 678. Do I hear a move? Any opposed? House Bill 742. I was going to put that one first, but I didn't think about it. Any opposition? I gave Terry 30 minutes. He's going to talk fast. All right, on page 2. Under modified open, 1067. Move. Any opposition? House Bill 1080. Any opposition? All right. House Bill 1115, and we're going to move it to modified structure. Any opposition? House Bill 1119. Any opposition? House Bill 1120. Any opposition? House Bill 1121. Any opposition? House Bill 1178. Any opposition? And then that grandest of all bills, House Bill 1198. Hey, you got your bills out already, hadn't you? You can put Mr. Willards down beside mine because he has been extremely helpful. All right, under modified structure, HB 100. Okay, under modified structure, HB 247, you have the amendment. The first thing would be, do I have a move on the amendment? All those in favor signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. All right. Now, HB 247 as amended, do I hear a move? Any opposed? That's on. HB 450. Any opposition? Third page. HB 685. Any opposition? HB 797. Any opposition? All those in favor signify by aye. Aye. Those opposed? Ayes have it. Okay. HB 827, you have an amendment on it, Mr. Hembry's bill. First, I need a motion on the amendment. 827. Yep. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor of the amendment signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, now on to the bill itself, 827. Do I hear move? Any opposed? It's on. Okay. Y'all bear with me a minute. HB 844. Any opposition? HB 872. Any opposition? Wait a second, back up. HB 872 has an amendment, Mr. Shaw's bill on the recycling. We have a motion on the amendment. Do I hear a second? All those in favor signify by aye. All right. Now go to the bill, 872. Have a move. Anyone opposed? All right, it's on. HB 985. Any opposed? HB 994. Any opposed? HB 1051. Any opposed? HB 1052. 1052 has an amendment? Let's back up to 1052. I didn't see the amendment. All right, Chief. All right, a move and a second. All those in favor of the amendment on 1052 signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Now go back and let's do 1052 with the amendment. All right, it's on. HB 1114. Move. Any opposed? Y'all hold on. All right, go back to 1114. There is an amendment to 1114. Do I hear a move on the amendment? Move. All those in favor of the amendment signify by aye. Aye. Now go back to the bill, 1114. Any opposed? All right, it's on. All right. HB 1123. 1123. It's your roommate's bill. Okay. Okay. HR 1160. Any opposed? HR 1161. Has an amendment, LC 371451S. Have a move and a second on the amendment. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? All right, now move on to 1161, HR 1161. Any opposed? It's on. Okay. HB 673. It has an amendment. That was the one we sent back yesterday. It was on the blue sheet yesterday. That's one Mr. Earhart asked. Have moved. All those in favor of the amendment signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Amendment's on. Okay, now HB 673. Move. Any opposed? Okay, under structured, I'm going to move 818 to modified structure. Move. It has an amendment. 818? Yes, it has an amendment. 880, it's under structured right now, but I'm moving it to modified structure. We have an amendment on that thing from the chairman. Do I hear a move on the amendment? All in favor of the amendment? Any opposed? All right, now move to HB 818 under modified structure. Do any opposed? It's on. Okay. HB 851. Any opposition? I have opposition to 851. All those in favor signify by aye. Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. It's on. HB 861. Any opposition? HB 868. Do I hear a move? Any opposition? It's on. HB 965. Any opposition? HB 967. Any opposition? It's on. HB under modified open. This is HB 665. Is there an amendment to that one? It is. There is no amendment. So HB 665. Any opposed? It's on. Mr. Vice Chair. I'd do that damn thing.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Rule 33.3, I'd like to move that floor debate on the following bills be limited to 1 hour, time to be apportioned by the presiding officer. House Bill 1114, House Bill 872, House Bill 797, and House Bill 861.
All those in favor signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Motion carries. That'll be your start. Listen up. Since I messed it up so badly yesterday in the well. That was called Larry was ragging me back there, and Edward was helping him. I couldn't keep my concentration. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock there will be a rules meeting to set Monday's calendar. Tomorrow for Mondays. So there might be some Senate bills. We have to listen to those folks. But I'll see y'all sometime tomorrow afternoon.
Good luck on the committee showing up at 9 o'clock for Senate rules after the dinner tonight. Are you kidding?